In this first chapter, we will discuss the technical aspects of working with a virtual orchestral library. And obviously, one of the fundamentals of this topic is which computer to use. We won't be going into specifics of different systems, etc., but we will be giving you some tips that we have learnt from our experiences of using a virtual orchestra within a computer. Obviously, one of the most important things is the speed of your processor. And as a lot of data is being moved around when using a virtual orchestra, you should look to have a fast processor. This isn't related to hard drive speed, which is a topic we will discuss, but just the fact that you need processing power, especially as some libraries will create samples on the fly and not just play them back from hard drives. When the library is playing back samples from a hard disk, obviously the CPU is not the critical factor. However, if you require low latency, which you almost certainly will if you are performing the musical parts from a musical keyboard, the CPU performance is very important. Next we come to the RAM, or random access memory. With RAM, more is better. We have recommended a minimum of 8 GB, but to be honest, as much as possible is probably the correct answer. Obviously, if you are just playing a few violin lines into a pop song, 8 GB will certainly be enough. However, if you are playing a complete orchestra from your computer, then you will almost certainly want more RAM. And the fact is, if you're playing libraries from your computer, you will want to get the most out of it. So we recommend as much RAM as possible. Obviously, you can also check with your virtual library developer's website where they will have a recommended minimum RAM requirement. And this will vary a lot between the different developers. But as a bare minimum, we would say 8 GB. Another reason to call 8 GB a bare minimum is that RAM is extremely cheap these days, so please don't save money on RAM. The next topic is hard drives. We've reached the point now where, with sample streaming being the norm, that we cannot avoid the current generation of SSD drives. An SSD drive is less like a hard drive and more like a memory card, and is therefore much quicker than a classic hard drive. However, it does have the downside of still being much more expensive than a normal hard drive. Having said that, the prices of these SSD drives has dropped in the last couple of years, and is now certainly affordable. One thing to consider is having an SSD drive in an external case, and storing your library samples on that drive, and then hooking that drive up to your computer with a fast interface, such as USB 3 or on a Macintosh, Thunderbolt. If your library is on the internal drive, ultimately it will slow your computer down. So we do recommend putting your library on an external drive or a secondary internal drive. Obviously, on the current generation of Macintosh computers, external is the only way. If you have a typical PC tower, fitting an internal drive is a simple matter. Of course, you can still use a classic hard drive, but loading of projects will be much slower if you are using a lot of samples. And ultimately, it will not be as fast as an SSD drive, even if you are using high-end hard drives with fast access times and a large cache. In our examples, I am using an external Thunderbolt drive with two 1 TB SSD drives in RAID 0 mode. Obviously, give yourself enough room on your SSD or hard drive so that you can expand your library without having to buy new drives within a few months. The next thing to consider is your monitor or monitors. Once again, bigger is better. If you are running 2 monitors, you can, for example, have your mixer on one screen. And in this way, you avoid having your orchestral plugin hidden. And this is a much more comfortable way of working. But of course, just having one larger monitor makes working more comfortable as well. But 2 monitors opens up more possibilities. You may be using a scoring program, such as Sibelius. And in this way, you can have your Arrange window open on one monitor and Sibelius open on the second monitor. Our next point is one that is often understressed. If you are building a PC or buying one, you may end up with a system which is noticeably loud if your computer is in your workspace. So if your computer is going to be in the same room as you, it is important to make sure that the noise it makes does not disturb you. In this video, we are using a Mac Pro that is in a separate room, but also an iMac which is within the workspace. However, the current generation of iMac are virtually silent, as is the Mac Pro series. If you are using a PC, I would recommend buying one from a reputable dealer rather than the cheapest one you can see online. There are many retailers who specialize in PCs for audio work, and obviously in those cases, the noise the PC makes is important to them as well as you. Also, don't forget that your hard drives and even some SSD drives will make a certain amount of noise. Now we come to the next topic, and that is which DAW or digital audio workstation to use. Here, we are not going to suggest a specific DAW, as this is basically down to personal preference and choice. Everyone can have their personal preference, and there is a large choice these days, such as Cubase from Steinberg, Logic from Apple, Ableton Live, PreSonus with Studio One, etc. All of these are capable of performing what is required, certainly when discussing virtual orchestral libraries. What is important is that your software can run many tracks and channels. When working extensively with orchestral music, you will require many tracks. Ultimately, you may end up needing tens or even hundreds of tracks, especially if scoring for film. This is yet another reason why CPU power and RAM is important. Once again, however, this will vary depending on how you intend using your library. If it is for scoring pop tracks, or for example jazz music, then you may only use a few tracks. The next topic is that of workflow. And obviously, once again, there is not one specific good workflow. Some people may say that Cubase is somewhat complicated, and this may be true, but it is also extremely powerful. So once you have set up your own workflow and understood your software, this may not be an issue for you. Others may say that Logic is too complicated. It is simply personal taste. What is important, however, is that you find the workflow that suits your way of working within your DAW. Almost all of the DAW available are extremely deep and require knowledge to get the most out of them. So whichever one you are using, it's important to learn its functions and key commands in order to have a good workflow. Now we come to a slightly more technical point, that of 64-bit compatibility, both for the sequencer or DAW and your plugin. What are the advantages and disadvantages of 64-bit? Well, the disadvantages are that it doesn't work faster or more efficiently. The advantage is simply how much data can be stored in the memory. With 32-bit software, you have 2 GB of RAM available as a maximum. If we take Cubase as an example, just opening Cubase with nothing else running such as plugins etc. requires approximately 500 megabytes. If we then add, for example, the contact player and we load a virtual library, all of these things require extra RAM out of that maximum, and we would soon exceed the amount of RAM available. With 64-bit operation, this limit is lifted, and so you have a lot more headroom within your system. As for compatibility, we don't know of any libraries that are not 64-bit compatible, so there is no reason not to be running your system at 64-bit. Another thing to note when using a large library is that if you load a full library of samples and don't use any of them, they are still using your memory and CPU. So if you are trying to have low latency within your system, apart from the factor of what hardware you are using, if you are using a low buffer such as 128 samples, then it is best not to load up your system with things you will not be using. Another point to consider is the value of your DAW in terms of performance and requirements. There are DAW systems that cost up to €2,000, and obviously systems that cost a lot less, or even free versions. But what is important is that you get the system that has what you need and is within your budget. Our final point is that of support. With support, I don't only mean support from your DAW developer, but also support from the third-party developers. What I consider important is how fast a developer reacts when there are bugs in the system or a plugin, or how fast and reliable the updates are. A situation you don't want is that of an upgrade to your operating system or your DAW leading to your virtual library not being compatible and having to wait for an upgrade. A tip here is to look in the forums of the developers and to get a feel of what previous users are saying about the topics of updates and upgrades. If, for example, you go to the Cubase or Logic user forums, you will quickly find out the general feeling towards upgrades and updates from other users. Next, we come to some miscellaneous points, such as a fast internet connection. These days, the majority of libraries don't come on a DVD, but are directly downloaded from the developer's website, or in some cases, such as Native Instruments Complete, they come on a hard drive. But in general, you will have to download them, and these days the libraries can be, for example, 50 gigabytes upwards. So the speed of your internet connection and the limit of how much data you can download is critical. Now we come on to backups. And obviously, if you're working with large projects, if anything goes wrong, you may lose your project, and so you need to be serious about backing up your projects and your libraries. The simplest way to do this is to use, for example, an external hard drive or flash drive USB stick. However, there are automated options, such as Time Machine on Macintosh and other equivalent options for PC. Something like Time Machine will just back up your data that has changed during the day, and will do this automatically at a preset time of your choosing. If your library is, for example, on an external hard drive, then you should at least have a copy of this, so that if something happens, you do not have to download the entire library once again, but can simply attach your backup hard drive to your system and carry on working. And last but not least, you need to make sure you have a good quality monitoring system. Obviously, this can be headphones, although high-quality studio monitors would be recommended, as this is critical for any work in the studio environment. But certainly when arranging for orchestra and listening to sample libraries, it is important that you are hearing your composition and arrangement as well as possible. The finer points of panning, equalizing, level setting, etc. require good monitoring to achieve good results. So now we've covered some of the points in what is required for working comfortably with sample libraries. These points are important, as it should be a pleasure to work with an orchestral library, and dealing with any hardware limitations will certainly not help with the pleasure, but also, more importantly, with the results of your work.